Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be filming a Ruth chapter 1 Bible study. I've never done this before and I feel a little nervous, but yeah, I'm just going to get right into it. I have my notes here just if you wonder why I'm looking down. So the first chapter of Ruth is broken up into two sections, and the first section encompasses verses 1 through 5. The greatest tragedy of this book, which is Elimelech, however you say his name, he and his family moved to Moab, and that is what we are going to be unpacking in this chapter. So the greatest tragedy of this book happens in 5 short verses. It's almost easy to overlook all of the meaning that's packed in there, but it's almost intentional, it seems, because God wants the focus of the book to be on redemption and not the pain and tragedy of people's choices. And the second section encompasses verses 6 through 22. It's the story of Naomi and Ruth returning and repenting. There's a lot more detail that is in that part of the story, and it's obvious that God wants us to focus on the path leading back to Him rather than the path that's going away. So now we're going to be reading Ruth chapter 1. So, verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone, without her 2 sons or her husband. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So the 2 of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?" So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman, and they arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the theme of this book is restoration, provision, redemption, commitment, and repentance. And the principles is that God can make good things come out of bad choices. God is sovereign over everything, and a repentant heart will step back into God's blessing. And the context of this book is the days when the judges ruled in Israel was not necessarily a good time for Israel. It was the time of chaos and oppression and fear. The judges did not necessarily lead the people to worship God, although several of the judges feared the Lord, such as Gideon. Others did not, and Israel fell into deep idolatry. And Judges 21:25 says, "In those days Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." Romans 3:10-12 says, "As the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. No one is truly wise. No one is seeking God. All have turned away. All have become useless. No one does good, not a single one." And what the verses are saying is that in our hearts, nobody is actually good. At our core, we all have a heart that naturally turns away from God. And so the only answer is Jesus himself. And so that is why Israel was always turning away from God, and they were never fully his, unless they had a king like David, or the good kings who actually led the people to follow God. But it just means that we have to have a heart change in order to truly be righteous, and have Jesus be our righteousness. The fact that there was a severe famine in Israel meant that Israel was being unfaithful to the Lord. Deuteronomy 11 verses 13-17 says, "If you carefully obey all the commands I am giving you today, and if you love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and soul, then he will send the rains in their proper seasons, the early and late rains, so you can bring in your harvests of grain, new wine, and olive oil. He will give lush pasture land for your livestock, and you yourselves will have all you want to eat. But be careful, don't let your heart be deceived so that you turn away from the Lord and serve and worship other gods. If you do, the Lord's anger will burn against you. He will shut up the sky and hold back the rain, and the ground will fail to produce its harvests. Then you will quickly die in that good land the Lord is giving you." Although God does not punish people by withholding rain, he does allow natural consequences to affect us when we make choices that aren't in alignment with him. The truth is that God does not bless sin. And so the question that comes out of that is, where is my heart in relation to God's plan for me? Am I submitting, obeying, and trusting God? Or am I choosing to follow my own heart because it feels good? Do I think I am good enough on my own? So Bethlehem means house of bread. It can also mean house of war in Hebrew, because bread and war comes from the same root. Jesus called himself the bread of life, and he also said, "Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword." And Jesus came to give life to those who would believe in him, but this produces a war between our flesh and our spirit. Choosing to follow Jesus means that we have to make different kinds of choices than people who aren't following him. People around us often won't understand what we do, and they might try to attack us for it. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 14 says, "But people who aren't spiritual can't receive these truths from God's Spirit. It all sounds foolish to them, and they can't understand it. For only those who are spiritual can understand what the Spirit means." To take it even further, a believer has to rightly divide the word of truth, and that comes from 2 Timothy 2 verse 15. There's a war in our hearts because we have the natural tendency to sin. What we feed on is the way we think. We cannot consume worldly things without becoming worldly minded, which will produce ungodly behavior. And the question that I think of from that is, what am I feeding on? Do I have the mind of Christ? Does my mind think the way the world thinks? Moab means of his father. Moab was descended from Lot. In Genesis 19:31-37, Lot's older daughter tried to preserve their family line through her father. She did not act in faith, and the result was disaster. Her son's name was Moab, and that's where the Moabites came from. They tried to curse Israel when Israel was going through the wilderness. They also oppressed Israel in the time of the judges. And it's interesting to note that in Ruth's time, Ehud was judge, and Ehud had killed Eglon, which was king of Moab, and he had been oppressing Israel. It's a separate study that you can do on your own. I didn't study into it, but it's just interesting to note that the Moabites had probably been oppressing Israel over this time. So the journey that Elimelech's family took to reach Moab was through the Jericho Pass, the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea, across the Jordan River. It was a literal path to leave the promised land, returning to the wilderness in which the Israelites had spent so much time wandering around. So Elimelech means God is king, but he did not live up to his name because he just chose to make his own decisions instead of seeking God. Naomi means pleasant or gentle. Mahlon means sickness, sickly. Kilion means pining or wasting away. And Ephrath, I'm not sure of all these pronunciations. Ephrath is derived from Ephraim, which means fruitful or fertile. Ephrathites were the founders of Bethlehem. Their family inherited the area of Ephrath, which became known as Bethlehem. Elimelech essentially discarded his inheritance. The area around Bethlehem was rich and fertile, so it seems ironic that Elimelech left because of famine. Sometimes it can seem as though the better decision is to leave and go back to the desert of the flesh to indulge in our sinful desires, but sometimes God doesn't come through in the way we want, and it looks like a better decision to take control and make our own choices. But as we're about to see, that does not produce the results that we want to see. Ironically, Elimelech's actions of moving to find a better life resulted in his death. His sons married Moabite women against God's commands. Deuteronomy 7 verses 3 through 4 says, "You must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you." Eventually, both of the sons died as well, and this shows us that when we leave God, it results in spiritual death. Romans 6 verse 23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." Orpah means neck or fawn. Ruth means friend. So now we're at the point where Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah were 3 childless widows, which was among the lowest, most disadvantaged classes of people. They could only survive on the generosity of strangers, and they had no family in Moab to support them. At least Naomi didn't. An excellent verse that comes to mind is James 1 verse 27. Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. And the question that I think of is, what are my actions towards those in need around me? Do I disregard others' needs? Do I complain about serving those below my status? Am I ashamed about being with others who are different from me? And now we see an act of faith. Naomi still wanted to be faithful to God, and she did something about it. She realized that to stay in Moab meant spiritual and possibly even physical death. Her one hope was to return home. She had lost her husband and sons. She had nothing left to lose besides her own life. She was willing to risk her life to travel back through the wilderness to get to Judah. She was a woman of great faith, whether or not she knew it. She had to have been the one who inspired Ruth's faith. Naomi set a great example for us. Her story is similar to the prodigal son who was so low and desperate that he figured he had nothing to lose by returning home. When we have nothing left, it takes a lot of humility to go back to where we left. When we stop receiving God's blessings, the best thing to do is to go back to where we knew we should have obeyed and we didn't. We can start over and we can obey the second time around. God was giving Naomi a second chance and she took it. And so we need to take the second chances God gives us. I wanted to mention that if you want access to my study notes, you can go to the link in my description and you can purchase them there. And Naomi wanted Orpah and Ruth to be comfortable and safe. She wasn't rejecting them. She knew that going to Bethlehem would be a huge sacrifice for them, leaving their family, their culture, their religion. She wanted the best for them, and she was being unselfish. Having lost her sons, she could have demanded them to stay with her. It was a loving act for her to release them. Naomi was a faithful woman. In spite of all the hardship and loss, she wanted to stay true to the God that she knew. She didn't try to manipulate God's plan. Naomi thought that the deaths of her husband and sons were a punishment from God because they had left and disobeyed, but she wasn't running away from God, she was going back. And the question that I think of is, what is my heart's response to difficulties? What do my actions and words and thoughts say that I believe about God? Do I blame him? Am I bitter? So, the grandmother of the Moabites, Lot's wife, she looked back at Sodom and she turned into a pillar of salt. If you remember that story, it's when Lot and his daughters had to leave Sodom, and at first Lot's wife was with them, but when they were part way away from the city, Lot's wife, she looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt because they were supposed to go and not look back. But now Ruth, she was a descendant of the Moabites, and she was doing the opposite. She was taking on the full identity of a child of God. And Colossians 3:1-3 says, "Since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand." Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth, for you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. Ruth was staying true to her name. She had been blessed with Naomi's friendship and love, and now she was repaying it. She had seen Naomi's faith in the face of loss, and she saw that Naomi's God was real. Her own gods weren't there for her, but she knew that the true God required a commitment because the hard times would test her faith. Her faith wasn't based on easy circumstances. She would rather have died than go back to Moab. And the question that I think of is, what kind of a friend am I? Am I faithful? Am I willing to change and grow? Am I willing to make commitments? And the walk from Moab to Bethlehem was mostly uphill, which parallels the spiritual journey. It goes against the grain to go towards God. And the word excited here means moved, to make an uproar or agitate greatly. Mara means bitter, which is the opposite of Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. Naomi was honest. She realized that her disobedience resulted in tragedy, and her attitude was humble and repentant. And the question that I ask myself is, am I repentant? Am I forgiving? Am I forgivable? And if not, why not? And a few interesting things to know about barley is barley was a staple food of the lower classes. Barley was a sign of God's blessing and provision. Deuteronomy 8:6-8 says, "So obey the commands of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land of flowing streams and pools of water, with fountains and springs that gush out in the valleys and hills. It is a land of wheat and barley, of grapevines, fig trees, and pomegranates, of olive oil and honey." Barley was a sign of new life. It was the first crop to ripen in the spring, and its harvest marked the beginning of the agricultural year. Naomi and Ruth arrived at the perfect time. They stepped right back into God's blessing and provision. And that wraps up chapter 1. So stay tuned for chapter 2, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time. Bye!